is making it simpler to listen and listen good. It's a bomb in the Army-Math Research Center, the university. It's going up in 5 minutes. Get everybody out of there, clear that area, warn the hospital. And I'm not bullshitting there. Get everyone out of there now.
The night started out as a very quiet night. Nothing out of the ordinary. If memory serves, there weren't many police, there weren't many calls for service that night at all. The dispatcher put a bulletin out to all the field units that he had just got a call from the Madison Police Department dispatcher regarding a bomb threat at Sterling Hall, and that the caller said that they weren't fooling, and the minute he finished they weren't fooling, the building went up. There was a tremendous explosion, and the dispatcher said, I guess they weren't.
When the bomb went off, I mean, it really shook me. It woke me out of a sound sleep, and believe me, I'm a sound sleeper. I lived about 3.5 miles from the site, and like I said, it woke me right up.
It was no noise that you would associate with any kind of prank that I've ever seen on a college campus. It was loud, it was intense, it was bright, everything shook, and then the sky just rained debris.
I knew that the bomb had gone off prematurely, and when that happened, it was just this, you know, really bad feeling crossed me.
Early on August 24th, 1970, a van loaded with 6 barrels of explosives blew up just outside the east wing of Sterling Hall at the University of Wisconsin campus in Madison. The bombing was carried out by 4 men who called themselves the New Year's Gang. They were protesting America's involvement in the Vietnam War. The bombing was directed against the Mathematics Research Center, a U.S. Army-funded facility which occupied part of the building. At least 26 buildings on the campus alone had been damaged in the bombing. The explosive used was ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, ANFO for short, the same type that would be used in the 1995 bombing at the Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Sterling Hall borders Bascom Hill, in the heart of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 1970, the east wing of Sterling housed Army Math, as it was known, the Department of Physics, and the Astronomy Department. At the time of the bombing, University Hospital was across the street. Mary Taylor is a retired nurse who was working in the hospital that night. A nursing assistant who lived in Germany during the bombings of World War II also was on duty.
She darted like a deer from one end of the ward and threw herself down on the floor in a corner, and she said, "You have to do this. This is a bomb." She said, "Once you've heard one of these, you'll never, ever forget."
Taylor's wing was shielded from the blast, but in the wing closer to Sterling, windows shattered. At least one patient was injured by flying glass. Fortunately, there weren't any patients directly down the alley from the bomb.
You know, we went into a women's ward, and I remember this lady saying, "Do you think they'll hear about this in Green Bay, Wisconsin?" I said, "I think they'll hear about this all over the world."
People around the world did hear about the Sterling Hall bombing in Madison. Even though it occurred between the summer and fall semesters at almost 4 in the morning, there were 6 people in the building when the van exploded. 4 were injured. Another was killed. He was Robert Fassnacht, a 33-year-old physics researcher.
We were just outside of Wanakee, and then a news report comes on that they were pulling a body out of Army Math. And we all went into shock. I mean, a couple of us were crying, and I just felt this overwhelming sense of shame that we had killed someone.
Fassnacht had been working late in a basement physics lab. He was married and had 3 children. He was also planning to go on vacation that week. Less than a week and a half after the bombing, the FBI had pieced together what happened and put 4 men on its most wanted list: 23-year-old Carlton Armstrong and his 19-year-old brother Dwight from Madison, 18-year-old David Fine from Wilmington, Delaware, and 22-year-old Leo Burt from Havertown, Pennsylvania. Fine and Burt were both students at Wisconsin. Carl had been an on-again, off-again student in previous years. The Armstrongs and Fine were eventually caught, convicted, and served time in prison, but Leo Burt has never been found. It's been almost 30 years since the bombing in Madison. Many history books and accounts of 60s unrest don't even mention it. Yet almost anyone who lived in this city at the time remembers that night. Many people close to the bombing did not want to talk about it for this documentary. The event is still a painful memory for many in Madison. There is no physical public memorial to Robert Fassnacht's death, either in Sterling Hall or on the campus. Yet a number of buildings are scarred from the bombing or other anti-war unrest in the 60s. Art Hovey is a former assistant to the chancellor of UW-Madison and has written a history of the campus.
Just over my shoulder is the area where the most damage was done and where the full force of the impact of the explosion was felt, and you can see the different colors of bricks and how much impact the actual detonation of the bomb had.
Where did the van park?
The van was parked just over there against the wall. You can see where those bike racks are, and it was approximately in that area.
Mike Zaleski is now an attorney in private practice in Madison. At the time of the bombing, he was an assistant district attorney in Dane County. Soon after, he became an assistant state attorney general. Zaleski says liberal isn't even the word to describe Madison in the 60s.
It was anarchy. You can't use any other word to describe what went on here other than anarchy. Classes weren't being held. The National Guard was on duty for long periods of time, sometimes with fixed bayonets.
UW-Madison has long been known for its political activism, but it intensified during the Vietnam War in the 60s. Tension peaked in the spring of 1970 after President Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia, and after 4 students were shot and killed by National Guard troops in Ohio. The bombing of Sterling Hall took place a few months later, in August.
It was a demonstration literally every 1 to 2 weeks for a couple of years, in which a lot of violence was done. Squad cars were overturned and set fire to. It was, I don't know if anybody ever thought, certainly I didn't, it would ever have gone to this extent as Sterling Hall, but the violence and the property damage was not unusual, at least for that time, of what was happening around here.
Herb Hansen is a retired UW police lieutenant. He and others say the protests really quieted down after the bombing.
And I think both sides just sat back and went, this is really, really, really out of hand. It was out of hand before, but it's way, way out of hand now.
Don Buchholz is an electronics supervisor for the astronomy department at UW-Madison. He went up on the roof of Sterling Hall several days after the bombing to check the department's telescopes.
If you look at the Lutheran church over there, there were a lot of broken windows. A lot of their glass windows were broken. Tile were gone off the roof. I don't remember if the cross was chipped off. Everywhere you looked in this general area were broken windows.
The Army Math Research Center moved to another building on campus after the bombing, but its sign remains in Sterling Hall today, now hanging above a chalkboard in a physics room. Most damaged equipment in the building was repaired or replaced, but Don Buchholz left one side of a cabinet the way he found it.
This cabinet was sitting in the machine shop, kind of in front of the windows. And as you can see, the holes, all the glass and whatever else came up was actually hitting it. You can see some of the glass actually went right through the cabinet.
Hugh Richards is a professor emeritus of physics at the University of Wisconsin. In 1970, he was named associate chair in charge of rebuilding Sterling Hall. One of his priorities was to get the nuclear particle accelerator back up and running.
This is the ion source area of the University of Wisconsin Tandem Electrostatic Accelerator, which suffered bomb damage in the Sterling Hall blast. It was rebuilt by December of that year and the accelerator back in operation.
The floor of Richards' lab was destroyed by the blast, and his equipment dropped down onto the lab below. But he considers himself lucky. Some physics researchers lost years of work and never resumed it.
These walls were blown down. These were just cinder block walls. And my office, which is here, these walls were down, and there was, of course, my books and all were all mixed in the rubble on the floor. And cleaning up the rubble, I did find the spare wheel of the van. It was in the rubble in my office, and I've just kept it there.
Today, Michael Molnar manages the instructional physics labs at Rutgers University in New Jersey, but he's still affected by the bombing in Madison that destroyed part of his doctoral research and almost took his life. That night back in 1970, Molnar was working in his office on the 6th floor of Sterling Hall. He was a graduate student in astronomy. Molnar was nearing completion on his PhD dissertation and had regularly been working until 2, 3, even 4 in the morning.
It was around midnight, and I was hungry. And on the 4th floor in Sterling Hall in those days, there was a vending machine. And so I went downstairs there to try to get a candy bar or something from there. The machine jammed. I said, well, I was hungry, and I had accomplished a lot, and why not go home? And I was way ahead of my objectives and making good accomplishments on the work. So I left and went to bed. The next thing I remember was being shook in bed by my good friend. He said, Mike, thank God you're in your bed. They just blew up your building.
Molnar got dressed and ran to Sterling Hall. Police wouldn't let people get up to the building, but what Molnar could see was not good.
And we could see this huge gaping hole there, smoke coming from one of the windows in the building. That smoking window was my office, which really disturbed me. I had a wooden desk in there, an old, beautiful wooden desk. And in those days, I used to smoke a pipe. And I had one of these butane lighters. And it was the butane lighter, the evidence indicates that it ignited with the explosion and just saturated the room with butane, and everything burnt. So the other thing I remember standing out there is that that night I left the only copy of my dissertation on that wooden desk. And so I figured that I was completely wiped out.
So Molnar went to a local bar to watch the news broadcasts and called his parents in New Jersey. About a week later, an astronomy professor was allowed back into the building.
Well, lo and behold, he was able to find in a puddle of water on the floor, right next to that burnt-out desk, parts of my dissertation. And he scooped it up and gave it to me.
Molnar has kept the remains of his original dissertation. He was able to reconstruct much of his work using it and some numbers he had given his advisor earlier.
You can see that it's pretty well burnt, and what we're looking at is the back side of the dissertation. It was lying face down in the water. So what I had to do, like an archaeologist, was quickly try to write everything down, go through each page, as you can see here. But as I went through it, the pages, of course, here's the data page, the pages got smaller and smaller and smaller. Then finally, and this is my data section, one of the most important parts here. And here, you can see one of the last back pages right there, this little piece here. So a lot of things were lost, but there was still enough here enabling me to get a dissertation that was done and published.
Molnar credits the support he got from faculty, staff, and friends as part of the reason he bounced back so quickly after the bombing. And although Molnar says he's pretty much put the bombing behind him, effects remain.
Well, it affected me, that's for sure. I've become a lot more cautious and aware of the loss that you can have through fire or an explosion. And over the last few years, I've been writing a book on the Star of Bethlehem. And almost every night, or at least every other night, I would make a backup of that file or those files for the book, put them on a floppy disk. And then I would take those floppy disks and I would put them in different places, not just in my house. So if you look at my house, I'm sure for the next 10 years we will find copies of floppies behind books, in the basement, in the attic. I took them outside, put them in my car.
Because he could have been killed in the bombing, Molnar's also grateful for the little things in life.
There's nothing more thrilling than when my son comes home from school and he says, Dad, I aced that exam. Wow, that's wonderful, all right? And or my wife shows me something that she's made or done. And all these little things, believe me, I do savor those now, more so than I think that I would have without this incident. That is, I really appreciate that I'm here, you know, and I can enjoy these things, and these things are very important and dear.
Mike Zaleski says Carl Armstrong and Leo Burt were the ringleaders of the 4 Sterling Hall bombers. Zaleski helped prosecute Carl Armstrong for the state of Wisconsin. It is Carl that served the most time for the bombing, about 8 years counting jail and prison. Dwight Armstrong and David Fine both served 3 years in prison for their roles. Leo Burt has never been caught. Carl Armstrong insists they never wanted to injure anyone in the bombing.
Probably the hardest part about the whole bombing is when we turned the corner from Charter Street into where the alley between where Army Math is. I was shocked because there were lights on in the building. And I was faced with probably the worst moment in my life because I had to decide whether or not to go through with the bombing.
Armstrong says they had done reconnaissance of Sterling Hall and thought no one would be inside at that early hour.
Went all the way up and down the building, everything was at ground level. Looking in the building, I had this big keychain with a big ball. And I was prepared to, you know, break the glass if I saw anyone in there and warn them about what was going to go on. And the room was vacant. You know, from all of our planning, this was the only time the bombing could really be done because, you know, in the next week, the students would be back, the building would be occupied, and decided to go ahead with the bombing.
That excuse doesn't sit well with Mike Zaleski.
If a building is basically dark and you see a light on, it's a pretty good indication someone's in there, number one. Number two, you know that there are night watchmen all through this campus. How do you know there's not one in there? And in fact, there was, who was seriously and permanently injured. Number three, think about that warning. Now, it did go off prematurely, but assume it had not gone off in 3.5 minutes, but even 5 minutes. How many police officers would have been killed by going to the scene?
Mel Greenberg is one of the attorneys who helped defend Armstrong. He says he doesn't believe Carl would have intentionally wanted to hurt anyone.
I don't believe that for a second. I don't think I know he isn't, and I don't think he ever was that kind of a person.
Well, I'm sorry, they're fully accountable for their actions. When you decide to do something violent, such as a bombing, all right, people will get hurt. You cannot take into account all possible contingencies.
See, that's the problem, and that's what's changed, is that, you know, I now realize that, you know, that any bombing like that, you know, there's just no way that you can guarantee that no one's going to get killed or injured.
Armstrong says he deserved to serve time because he should have known that risk was very high. The bombers split up soon after the blast. Carl was caught in Canada a 1.5 years later. After a 13-month legal battle, he was extradited back to Wisconsin to face charges including first-degree murder and arson. Armstrong faced additional charges for earlier arson attempts and sabotage. They included attempts to firebomb a temporary building that housed ROTC classrooms, the UW Armory, also called the Old Red Gym, and the Primate Research Center. Carl pleaded guilty to reduced charges including arson and second-degree murder in the death of Fassnacht. Second-degree murder was defined as causing a death by conduct imminently dangerous to another and showing a depraved mind regardless of human life. During the sentencing hearing, the defense strategy was to try to put the Vietnam War on trial. They wanted to show that Armstrong bombed Sterling Hall because he deeply believed that U.S. actions were criminal and had to be stopped. Former prosecutor Mike Zaleski says he was against the war, but this was a media show.
It was a ridiculous attempt to put the war on trial. Why? Because you bring in some Vietnam soldiers or veterans and say, well, here's what I saw. Well, how does that change anything? There are a lot of people who saw the Viet Cong brutally murdering Americans. Who's right, who's wrong? It has nothing to do with it.
But Mel Greenberg disagrees.
I think we try to get in the Nuremberg precedents, for example, where you see a government, where if you're an individual citizen and you see a government doing something wrong and terrible, you cannot, only can you not be complicit in that, you have to do what you can to try and draw attention and stop it. It's not to say that the act was appropriate, but that was the whole point of the thing.
Carl Armstrong was sentenced to 23 years in prison, which was later reduced to 14 years. The Madison City Council and the Capital Times endorsed his early release when he was up for parole. Armstrong got out in January of 1980. Armstrong came back to Madison and shared an apartment with this man, Phil Ball. Ball is a former member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He was also on the Carl Armstrong Defense Committee and later worked for former Madison Mayor Paul Soglin. He now works for some friends at a bar and cafe in Fort Atkinson, about an hour away. Ball says the bombing of Sterling Hall was wrong, but he says a sense of proportion is missing when comparing Carl's actions to what America did in Vietnam.
If 3 million people died because of your policy, which has been closely studied and involves the best and the highest use of American technology, you're called an architect of American foreign policy and awarded the Nobel Prize. That's with 3 million. If one person dies that you don't know and that you've taken a lot of precautions to ensure does not die, but there's a possibility, and it's not an unreasonable possibility, that you knew this person might be severely injured and in fact might die, you're a horrendous, despicable criminal who deserves to get the electric chair.
The U.S. dropped more tons of bombs in Vietnam than all the countries in World War II dropped combined. 58,000 Americans died in the war, along with an estimated 2 million North and South Vietnamese. Many were civilians. Armstrong says it's impossible to pinpoint one event that made him go from being a Boy Scout when he was young to a bomber. But he says marching during the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago certainly had an effect. So did hearing about Kent State. Armstrong says his motivations for bombing the Army Math Center have not changed, that if it were theoretically possible to be sure no one would be killed or injured, he feels the bombing would be justified in light of American actions. But Michael Molnar says the bombing would have been wrong even if no one were physically injured.
That bomb also destroyed the lives, the careers of a lot of scientists who had nothing to do with the war in Vietnam. In fact, even some of those people who were working in that building or had research labs in there were against the war movement.
Armstrong has previously apologized publicly to the Fassnacht family and to those injured in the blast.
And I'd like to add that, I also apologize to the people that, innocently lost research in the bombing.
You don't apologize to the government?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I'm still waiting for justice. I'm waiting for the war criminals to be put on trial.
Phil Ball says he wishes he had organized to shut down the Army Math Center before the bombing using a different method.
In fact, there wouldn't be much of a debate if people had gone into Army Math, and they wouldn't have even had to have destroyed it. They simply said, we're just going to strip it. And like ants, they just keep coming. Gandhi-esque. And they lift up the file cabinets.
How much of a military role the Army Math Research Center had was disputed even after Sterling Hall was bombed. In 1973, the Madison Collective of Science for the People issued a report called the AMRC Papers on the role of the Math Center. It charged that the AMRC's permanent staff, in a highly productive mathematical atmosphere provided by the remaining staff, are deeply involved in the most fundamental aspects of military research, the design and testing of weapons, and the creation of military and political strategy. But the advisory committee of the Math Research Center countered with its own report in January of 1974 that said, the MRC is engaged solely in unclassified basic research in theoretical and applied mathematics, and, while the results are of enough value to the sponsors that they continue their financial support, the results are of even more value in a wide range of human affairs and make an important contribution to the public good. Whatever the role of the Math Research Center or American actions in Vietnam, Molnar still sees the bombing as senseless.
I don't know how we could justify that bombing to the family of Robert Fassnacht and his children. I just don't understand how anybody could say that your daddy died for a good cause. I know I couldn't.
Now in his 50s, Carl Armstrong continues to live in Madison. He runs a juice stand on the State Street Mall during the warm weather months, with drinks named after 60s activists. But Phil Ball says Armstrong will always live with the realization he killed a man. Ball also says the bombing of Sterling Hall is a story worth examining.
And it's worth trying to understand it from all sides. And I mean from all sides, including 4 guys scared to death when they perpetrate an act that leads to a death, and try to understand it from Fassnacht's point of view, and then try to understand it from his wife's point of view and those kids. And then you'll get some insight into this reality of ethics when you try and translate it into politics. And that was our generation. That was the generation that was brought up to believe you will not be a silent German. That has consequences.
Michael Molnar mentions the Sterling Hall bombing in the beginning of his dissertation, completed almost 30 years ago. He feels he was never able to address the issues in an eloquent way, but he still agrees with the point of what he wrote.
In this bombing, a researcher died, several people were injured, and many lost their lives' work. This dissertation is dedicated to those people and to the hope that such events will never occur again. So be it.